Thank you, Femi. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the panel on multipolarity, geopolitics, and norms in making peace. So we're not talking about peacekeeping, but we're talking about peacemaking. This panel was put together in cooperation with Accord, one of the leading peacebuilding organizations in Africa, and I'm particularly delighted to co-moderate this session with its executive director, Dr. Vasu Gounden. Let me briefly set the scene for our ensuing discussion. We are at a critical juncture in world's history. There is a reordering of power relations in a global system with complex implications for peace and security. From the 1990s until recently, international peacemaking was generally guided by the liberal peace paradigm. While subject to critique and profoundly challenged by the US-led global war on terror, there was broad consensus on the goal of reaching a mediated agreement between warring parties backed by peace operations, then supporting elections towards a liberal democratic order and economic integration into global markets. This was based, in part at least, on the understanding that liberal democracy, with its normative tenets, human rights, gender equality, transitional justice, was key for building sustainable peace. The goal and process of peacemaking were therefore transformative. So not only ending the violence, so stabilization measures, but addressing the root causes of the conflict. So transformation of behaviors, of structures, of institutions. Geopolitics has been less conducive for this approach in recent years, which had once actually benefited from alignment around the goal of peace. There have been few breakthroughs in negotiated peace agreements, and even where implemented, it often falls short in delivering on promises of sustainable and democratic societies. While global institutions have weakened, new powers are taking more active roles in peacemaking, guided by their own sets of values and norms, challenging precisely this liberal peace paradigm. In this environment, conflict parties can obviously more easily choose their counterparts, whether for deal brokering on the terms of settling war or for armaments and diplomatic cover. So, does this mean that multipolar configuration of power is the end of normative order? Not necessarily. Multipolarity does not inevitably have to lead to chaos and destructive competition. Our challenge is to identify conditions in which countries might find it in their interest to cooperate. Now, how might we collectively recommit to shared norms that can enable shared security and development in the interest of sustainable but also just peace? So this session is intended to do two things. First, help us better perceive these global changes and their implications for peacemaking. And second, to provoke thinking around what we might work towards as a global community. And hopefully we will be able to also come up with some actionable recommendations or concrete recommendations. It's now my pleasure to welcome our distinguished panelists who are positioned differently in this emerging global context with vast experiences and unique perspectives. Madam Dr. Binta Diop, founder and chair of Femmes Africa Solidarité, AU Special Envoy on Women, Peace and Security. Madam, please come to the stage. Dr. Henry Wang, founder, Center for China and Globalization, former Counselor, China State Council. Dr. Günther Bechler, former Swiss ambassador to Georgia, mediator, special envoy for Nepal, Sudan, Southern Caucasus, and Cameroon. And Mr. El-Gassim Van, former UN SRSG and head of MINUSMA, the UN mission to Mali. Yes, please. So welcome, and let me start with you, Dr. Binta Diop, or as you are called, Mama Diop in the African continent. You are known as the most formidable fighter for women's rights in Africa. You have always been deeply passionate about peace and security, about women and youth inclusion. You are also the co-convener of African Women Leaders Network. And in 1996 already, you founded the NGO Femmes Africa Solidarité to promote women's participation in peace processes at a time when this subject was actually not really globally recognized. And now for 8 consecutive years, you've been holding the post as the EU Special Envoy for WPS. So with your deep knowledge and experience on the topics we're discussing today, could you point to 2 salient features of how geopolitics and multipolarity is playing out in today's conflicts in Africa?
Thank you so much. Good morning. Let me just say. Good morning, and I apologize for my voice coming from Senegal, and I got a cold in the plane, so my apology for that as well. So let me just start also, because we talk about conflict that are happening, maybe the previous panel about in Europe and Gaza, it still continue also in Africa. As you know, we are in the month of commemorating the genocide in Rwanda this month, 30 years of genocide. And I think we are saying and still Africa is experiencing conflict and war. So have we learned something from those, the war at that time? So coming to your question, as we say today, the world order, as it has been said, is evolving. We started with bipolarity at that time with the Soviet Union and the US, the Cold War, and it goes to unipolarity. And now we are facing complex multipolarity because we have a lot of different actors, external actors, intervening in our peacemaking. I would not say in our conflict, but in our peacemaking, which is something that we need to look at how they in the landscape. So in Africa, the landscape also evolve as we are evolving in this. So let me just say how those actors are intervening in, the geopolitics motivation, maybe, and the geostrategy. Starting with the geostrategy, which really have to do, and they intervene directly or indirectly with a view of, I think it has very much link to our resources. We didn't talk about it too much, the natural resources in Africa, and to, directly with our, governments and so on and so forth. So that geostrategic motivation, where different actors directly or indirectly. The other one is the motivation between the competition. It has been said again, the competition between the major powers for control as well, but also that might fuel the conflict in Africa. So in our multipolar context, Africa, the warring parties find themselves, going with one side, supporting by one, and I think that is a competition. Sometimes, fuel the conflict rather than resolving ours. So to summarize, the key drivers, behind the new external, multipolar actors into Africa conflict is really, motivated by this competition and so on and so forth. So it does not help in the peacemaking in that way. But at the end, what people have said is that, the multilateral system have to be really reinforced and supported. And one thing that we need to address is Africa being also sitting at the Security Council. Africa have to have a permanent seat. Ambassador have said it, that Germany is fighting for it, and I think it's a time for us as well, as African, to be seen, being part of this international, being part of it and benefiting from it and having the voice of African being heard if multilateralism has to work on the right way. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I may ask a follow-up question to you, Benta. So there are multiple actors, as you were saying. Geopolitics is also playing a major role in the conflicts. But how have these dynamics really also affected the efficacy of the African Union with its APSA, with its African Peace and Security Architecture?
Yeah.
Briefly.
I think when we look at this on the norms, Africa with the APSA which is the Africa Peace and Security Architecture, with a comprehensive approach. I think we're not missing the mechanisms and the norms, the normative, based on the, as you stated, the international norms. Africa have put in place the mechanism, but also we have seen that sometimes is a dependency of Africa when it comes, for example, in the funding. And I think Africa was trying to make sure that we don't continue to depend on other partners, but we are, like revitalizing the peace fund and so on. We have a panel of the wise as well in the architecture where you can, deploy when you see early warning, it has been said before, and we can have early response. So the APSA is well designed. There may be some gaps in terms of the the standby force, which is not really functioning. So the design of the architect, it's beautifully done. The problem that we have seen is the implementation. It has been said is the action. When you detect early warning, how do you go? But we will discuss that later on. I'm sure that the countries that don't accept many times that we can interfere in this. So I think we have the good architecture in Africa. It was well designed by the African Union, but member states and so on. And we have seen some success where the APSA have been doing great. But in the meantime, we still have many challenges that we face in the implementation of APSA as well. So, and one of its success is really women, peace and security. But I will come back to that because everything that we say is how do we create the environment, the mechanism for implementation. We have women mediators like FemWise. We have the Africa Women Leaders Network that are leading mediation right now in Africa. So we have certain success stories that are going on by civil society and so on, but still early warning, early response, and having impact for the people and the population. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Binta. I'll hand over to you, Vasu, to moderate Henry's input. But just to also conclude, so the main problem is implementation and action, not so much policies, because policies are already there. So most probably also the multipolar world is affecting the implementation also of these policies.
And accountability. It has been also said here that we need to measure, we need to make sure that we review and we see how to implement, and sometime my position as special envoy and bringing the voice of the women, I say, why don't we also sometime name and shame when it doesn't work? When you look at, and we will come back to that issue in mediation, we say we need more women in mediation. It's not happening. How can we make sure that it is there? So how? It's not only in Africa, but it's globally. Everybody say 1325 is our tool, and we need to use that to implement. But is the mediator everywhere? A mediator is always the man. Great. We need the he for she, positive masculinity. But at the meantime, you will find that maybe in his contract or terms of reference, we don't have some of them, like President Mandela at the time of Burundi. We know with Vasu how we were working with him on Burundi, a positive man who can bring the voice of the women at the table. And we don't have, So how do we make sure that, what we take as a decision, Security Council, but how do we implement them is a question. And to the accountability, as well, is not there. So we need to put that platform to make sure that we measure it with the indicators to say that a name and shame when it is necessary, to say it's not happening, and for all of us together to find solution together. I think that is where for us it's important at the African Union also, not only the world, but the African Union in this change that is happening in the world. But again, going back to the multilateralism, I think that is, for the time being, what we have there, but we cannot neglect also until it's fixed. Maybe what Germany will do with the South Africa, revisiting, in September, maybe new things will come. Maybe Africa will find its way to say, we are part of it. We're talking about peacemaking, not peacekeeping today, but there are so many challenges that Africa is facing with the partners that need to be addressed in the meantime. But I am not saying that it's everything is perfect in our conflict in Africa. No way. We have seen so many conflicts going on. We will talk about Sudan, we will talk about East Congo and so on and so forth, and other places where we are. But we can see some progress that also is happening. So the glass is half full and half empty. Thank you, depending where you position yourself.
Of course.
Thank you.
No, thank you, Lakshi. Andrew, as an African, the significance or irony of this building has not escaped us. Fortunately, I think fortunately we are not the representatives of Otto von Bismarck or King Leopold sitting here and reshaping Africa. Fortunately, today we're talking about a world that is reshaping. And Henry comes from a country that is at the center of the world that is reshaping, China. So, Henry, your country over the last several decades has grown economically to be a powerhouse. Militarily, it's a powerhouse also. And over the last few years, we have seen China grow in political influence. I think what worries us is with this growing divide between the United States as a bloc with its allies and China as a bloc with its allies. what hope is there that we would be able to get consensus on the major challenges that face us as humanity and be able to collectively resolve them? Because we've seen now in the last few years, we're in real deep trouble when it comes to that.
Yeah, thank you, Yasu, and also thank the organizer Andrew and Foundation for inviting. I was here in February attending the Munich Security Conference. I'm glad to see Ambassador Christopher is here. So it's great. I think this conference couldn't be more timely as we all gathered here. I really enjoyed the last panel as well. I remember last year when last May I was in Berlin and attending the Global Solution Summit. Chancellor Olaf Scholz said, the unipolar world is gone and we are in the multipolar world. And of course, we're talking about multipolarity. So what I think the first, these important things is that we have to really build up the trust between the big players. Because if the big players has no trust, then you have proxy war, you have all those regional conflicts, and that is really a big challenge I think we are facing for the world. And what I really think is important is that, for example, the biggest economy like U.S., EU, China, the three largest economy of the world, they have to work together, And I'm very glad that just recently, China, U.S. and EU had their ministerial meeting in Hangzhou talking about food security, which is a great initiative. I proposed at Munich Security a few years ago. I said, we should have a trilateral meeting of the biggest players so we can build up some confidence, build up some trust, so that they can talk. I'm very pleased to see Chancellor Olaf Scholz actually is in Beijing and has had meetings with President Xi and Premier Li and actually reached some consensus on how to approach the crisis in Ukraine and in Gaza. So I think that sets a good example of how we can really talk together to solve those kind of problems. I agree with what Ambassador Christopher just mentioned also about reform of the UN. We have to live with the UN Charter, and also probably reform the Security Council as well. I have a proposal I'm thinking of, since G20 now is really getting more prominent with African Union in it. It's G21. So can we have a mechanism and that get the G20 countries, in addition to the 5 permanent members, the other 16 can rotate at permanent council, and also enjoying the veto and non-veto so that they can rotate for all those members. And that'd probably be a good idea also, because then we can really solve this deadlock, a veto for the veto's sake, and we can get things done. So that's just one of my personal ideas of how we can probably reform that. But I think the other thing we should really do is we should still continue to push the economic globalization, because I see right now we see the security is a bit more. I agree. The military budget of every country has been driving up, of course, due to the Russian war on Ukraine, and we see that happening. But it's very unfortunate. We should use more budget for the development, for the sustainable climate change and things like that. So, how we can work on that? So I think the way China is doing is really push for economic globalization. China has established the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And India is the largest recipient of the infrastructure loan. And of course, China has launched the Belt and Road Initiative, invested $1 trillion for 3,000 projects for the Global South. I mean, it's not perfect, but So I'm thinking, things like that, can we work together? I mean, with Build Back Better World, with EU Global Gateway, with India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, and things like that. Let's get all those consensus. We have to build up consensus with the common threat. We should raise our budget for fighting climate change, fighting pandemic, fighting AI risk and side effect and things like that. We should not fight among ourselves. I mean, that's where I think that probably UN has to be strengthened. That we should have UN peacekeeping force play important role. Like we could probably have the UN peacekeeping force in the Gaza that really, trying to make a ceasefire enforced.
Andre, on that economic globalization issue, Iran is now a major trading partner with China. And of course, we know the influence the US has on Israel. Is there any chance that the US and China might work together to de-escalate this current crisis that's facing the world?
Absolutely. I mean, I know Secretary Blinken called our Foreign Minister Wang Yi just a few days before Iranian strikes Israel. And actually, yesterday, Foreign Minister Wang Yi called the Iranian Foreign Minister, urging the Iranians to keep calm and not to retaliate. But also, China condemns Israel attacks on the consular, premises in Damascus. So I think that I agree. We have to avoid double standards. I mean, we have to really safeguard the principles, and so that I think China probably is positioned better in doing this kind of mediation and talks. For example, China's strike the deal for Iranian and the Saudis in the first place, which is very important because China has no historical baggages. China never invaded them. China never colonized any place before. China was the largest trading partner for all of them, all the Gulf countries and Iranians. So if China stand out to say, okay, look, please, guys, don't fight. I mean, they probably would like to give face to China for doing that. So I think, probably China would be a good guarantor for the Middle East crisis, for the Ukraine-Russian crisis in the future. I mean, we could play more role. I mean, that's why I'm very glad to see, Chancellor Olaf Scholz and President Xi had a talk at the Diaoyutai Garden, and then really they come out with a statement that have a joint statement on Iranian and on the Gaza and Ukrainian issue. So this is really good progress, and I hope G20 countries can also do like that, and I hope US and China, EU, China, and Global South and China, we can all work together. And also I see BRICS actually expanded as well. So that is really shows that economic globalization still has attraction. People want to come to the economic globalization and then really worry about this military expansion, and that's facing the danger of the world.
Thanks. Lakshay?
Let's come to you now, Günther. You have dedicated all your life actually to finding peaceful, negotiated solutions to violent conflicts, first in academia and NGO world as the director of Swiss Peace. Then you moved on to SDC, the Swiss Development Corporation. So I also am curious to hear whether, what you think about building peace through development, but we'll take it up later on. And then in diplomacy, but beyond all these official titles and functions, I have always known you as a person who always speaks his mind. And so I think you can really be considered as the moral voice in our field. I was kind of a bit struck also with the earlier discussion about military spending, and for several decades, European countries have invested a lot in soft power and mediation, peace-building support. And with Ukraine, obviously, we had Zeitenwende, as Chancellor Scholz has put it. It has obviously shaken the whole normative and security order in Europe. As a result, we have spent now a lot of money on military aid and on escalated actually military spending, while peace building faces massive cuts. So I wonder what this development actually mean for all of us, and also might this herald a paradigmatic shift in terms of values and strategy more broadly?
Thank you, Lakshmi. It's a great honor to be here to talk to you today. I especially want to say hello to my friends from Cameroon. There are some very strong women's voices, and we work together. I want to come back to this later. Yes, I think it was also addressed in the previous panel. You know, we missed a few opportunities in the last 10, 20 years when it comes to real peace diplomacy. We were quite tolerant to processes that did not work or were ongoing for 10, 20 years without real results. I think we have to really reshape peace in a way that we focus together, maybe with a triple nexus: development cooperation, humanitarian aid, foreign policy, including private actors, institutions like Accord and Berghof, to really strategize and to focus on processes that work. So multipolarity is not a new challenge in that sense, you know. I mean, it's not at the end yet. They are still fighting different kind of centers in the world about what does multipolarity mean at the end of the day. So it's a process, it's ongoing, and that's why it is maybe quite risky at times. It is not clear where the poles really are, so there's competition, there's a lack of trust maybe, so we are not at the end here. And I would say, as a mediator also with Switzerland, we have to be quite innovative. We should not give up on norms. We should not flirt with dictators. We should be very clear on our norms on mediation and peace building and be clear in our messages. And I think it's not the problem of norms that are disputed around the world, maybe from some dictators, but populations in different conflict-prone countries, you know, they criticize our double standards. And here we have to work on. And I think it was said in the previous panel, I will not come to this. Innovative approaches, what does it mean? I would like to give you two examples. How we can maybe move forward in the peacemaking in this difficult environment. And the environment is very difficult. One is about the Darfur process in Doha. So Doha for us, for Switzerland, was of course a challenge. On the one hand, they wanted to be mediator. On the other hand, we always try to collaborate with Doha. We try to establish capacities for mediation and peacemaking in the foreign ministry in Doha. So to be very close and see how we can also transfer some of our experiences, the value-based approach, to an actor like Qatar. And I think it worked to some extent. And a good example is the Doha process about Darfur with Jibril Bassoleh as a chief mediator. I was closely working with him. And we managed to bring our strategy really to the table. We invited Darfuri civil society, traditional leaders, women's group. So a kind of multi-track approach to Doha. Sheikh Al-Thani opened in a very huge ceremony the meetings, but they did not interfere in our activities around the mediation table. So this was very clear. The mediation is to the special envoy, Jibril Bassoleh, and our task force. And I think this kind of collaboration with Doha from the Swiss Foreign Ministry made it possible that we could launch a multi-stakeholder, multi-track process in Doha about Darfur. And for me, it was a very good example that we can work also with actors that may have a kind of different background. I would not say it always works, but we have to be very sure in a context I just mentioned, the development cooperation, peace promotion and others, to come together and think in a strategic way. The second example is about Ukraine. You know, if we would focus now on a traditional peace conference with both conflict parties to the table, it would not work. Russia and Ukraine at the moment would not engage in a comprehensive peace process and in a conference with a peace agreement. But of course, the initiative of Zelensky, he launched also during the World Economic Forum in January in Davos, was about a peace summit, based on 4 different rounds, technical rounds, on technical issues of a peace process in Ukraine. So his idea was to bring world leaders together, as many countries as possible, to think about possible ways to peace in Ukraine. So Switzerland agreed with Zelensky in Davos to host this conference, to work hard, to invite states, leaders, China, the BRIC states and others, knowing exactly that Russia will not attend. And I think Lavrov and others were quite cynical about this process. They attacked Switzerland, etc. But our Federal Council said, yes, we do it. It's an initiative of the victim of an aggression. And we want to show there is a possibility to make peace. And the world community should be there and discuss and go down to operational details, even if one party, the aggressor, is not there. I think it's a step towards maybe a bigger conference, Europe-wide, kind of Helsinki 2 or whatever, can be envisaged in 2-3 years. So this kind of things, maybe it was not evident in Bern at the beginning. They said, if Russia will not come, we cannot do it. No, this is the wrong approach. I think we have to find innovations in peacemaking. We should not focus on processes that do not work. We have to take opportunities and go forward. And this is my first message maybe here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Günther. Can I give the floor to you?
Juan, can I be so bold as to say that you are the poster child for global civil servant? I first met you in '93 at the Organization of African Unity. You spent over 20 years, OAU, AU, and if anybody's fingerprints can be clearly seen on the African peace and security architecture, it's yours. You helped shape it. And when we look today on the continent, we have exponential population growth, 1990, 600 million people when we were all starting this architecture. Today, 1.4 billion people, 800 million more people, rapid urbanization, and a huge development deficit in all of this. Poverty, unemployment, inequality, climate change, and now with this emerging multipolarity, the geopolitics, we've got players now not sitting in a hall like this reshaping Africa. They're on the ground reshaping Africa from everywhere. So is the African Union and its architecture currently fit for purpose to deal with the current challenges? And then since you went from there to the UN, part of DPKO, and then as SRSG in Mali, is the UN fit for purpose today to deal also with those challenges? Just reflect on the AU and the UN.
Thank you, Vasu. I'm also very happy to be around and to see old friends and old faces. And thank you, Andrew, for inviting me. A small correction, we met in 1994, not in 1993.
You were 1 year older.
Yeah, 1 year or younger. Now, I think my answer as far as the OAU is concerned, I think the short answer is that the framework, the tools are fit for purpose. I'm absolutely convinced about it. I think Madam Binta Diop did say the same and make the same point. The challenge for the AU and for many African institutions is a challenge of implementation. When you look at the history of the OAU transition to the AU in 2001, the AU was launched in 2002. When you look at from the period 1963, when the OAU was founded, to now, The organization has gone through many iterations, has significantly enhanced its capacity, its norms, its institutions to deal with peace and security challenges. We moved from an organization from 1963 to 1993 that did not have a single structure wholly dedicated to conflict management. Well, there was one, but it never functioned. It was the Commission on Mediation, Conciliation and Arbitration, which was created in July 1964. We moved from an organization that faithfully observed the principle of non-interference into the internal affairs of member states, which meant that internal conflicts, the dominant feature of violence and conflict in Africa, were outside the remit of the organization. We moved from an institution that had no mandate to carry out peacekeeping operations. And in 1993, in Cairo, in June 1993, a declaration was adopted which set up a mechanism for conflict prevention, management, and resolution, softened the implementation or the understanding of the principle of non-interference, therefore putting internal conflicts within the remit of the organization, strengthened the capacity of the AU, its mandate to carry out preventive activities, which of course imply that you interfere into a country's domestic affairs, and allowed the organization to undertake peace support operations of limited durations and scope, being understood then that the UN should remain the main implementer of large and complex peacekeeping operations. And then in 2002, in Durban, as you know, the Peace and Security Council protocol was adopted, and it went further. The AU has now a very strong mandate to do prevention, It has a strong mandate to carry out large peacekeeping operations as a result of the failure of the AU and the UN to stop the genocide against the Tutsis in 1994, and now even a mandate to interfere in internal conflicts in situations of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crime. And then, more importantly, the AU also made principles of democracy, human rights, accountability, good governance as part and parcel of the African peace and security architecture, and the link was made very clear between a country that is properly governed and lasting stability. In addition to that, when you look at also the last 30 to 20 years, or 20 to 30 years, the AU has adopted a number of instruments on governance, democracy, and human rights. You know them all. The African Charter on Democracy, Governance and Elections of 2007, the Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption of 2004, all the NEPAD principles leading to the APRM, the African Peer Review Mechanism, meant to foster peer-to-peer discussions on domestic governance issues, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights that dates to 1991, but supplemented later on in 2003, I believe, by a protocol on the rights of women, the African Court of Justice, and Human Rights, the African Commission on Human Rights, and so on. So I strongly believe that we have all the tools we need. We have a very rich normative and institutional framework to deal with all cycles, all phases of conflict cycle, from prevention to actual mediation, peacekeeping, peace building, and so on. But the challenge, as I indicated, is a challenge of implementation. And if I was to make a recommendation, well, it's a point I have made while I was working at the AU, but I kept repeating it. AU or Africa should freeze policy formulation and focus on implementation. And I believe President Kagame, in his report on the reform of the AU, did emphasize also that challenge of implementation. How do we focus people's work, minds, and energies on implementing? And I'm absolutely certain if we were to improve implementation, the situation of the continent can change very dramatically. And maybe just one last point on the, because the point was raised on multilateralism, on the emergence of new actors. The whole thrust of the AU peace and security architecture is precisely to foster a multilateral approach to peace and security challenges, to do away with transactional politics. Hence the importance of these frameworks. But again, they need to be revitalized. The principles, the norms agreed upon need to be implemented more forcefully, more efficiently, and that will require renewed political will from member states, accountability, as Madam Job said, and then to do away with this endless drive towards policy formulation. Whenever we have a new policy, we want a new one, and you never focus on implementation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, now let's move to normative challenges guiding the goals of peacemaking. And perhaps I'll start with you this time, Günther. You were saying we shouldn't flirt with dictators and autocrats. But if we look around, the latest statistics show quite a bleak picture, right? For the first time in 2 decades, we have more close autocracies than liberal democracies. I think 57% or 57 countries are classified, designated as authoritarian states, and 72% of the world population is living under authoritarian conditions. So we are actually dealing with authoritarian states, and so the question is, how do you then deal with them? Do you engage? Do you disengage? Do you enforce sanctions? But then sanctions will most probably affect the civil society and the local population. So how to engage with them? Because obviously, the European peacemakers have always championed, were champions of liberal democracy and norms, and we have to somehow deal also with the situation of that we have more autocracies than liberal democracies. So how do you deal with that, and how do you deal with that challenge?
First of all, we have to be aware that in our own societies and so-called Western countries, we do have quite a few people with an authoritarian mindset. So they admire also this kind of development. They admire autocratic rule, because it's maybe more efficient, shorter ways, of legislation, and so on and so on. So we have to work within our own societies, first and foremost, to strengthen again the democratic and liberal basis of our societies, adherence to norms, both inside the country but also in the international law, international humanitarian law. I think there is really a slope going downwards also in our countries. And if you would ask me how many stable, trustworthy democracies we have in Europe, I would not mention that many. Maybe 2 hands or 1 hand is enough to count. So this is the problem. And if we deal with it, we would be much stronger also in the international sphere to defend our norms and values, not in a unilateral way, but we have to collaborate, of course, with many, many states that are maybe not at the same level when it comes to norms and values, but they might be open for dialogue, for cooperation, for sharing, certain issues, for sharing also issues on development, humanitarian. And so we have to slowly move forward again. And I want to respond to some extent to Henry, That's a good example. He said, we want to cooperate. Yes, of course, cooperation is important. Isolation would not work. But cooperation has to go hand in hand with readiness to compromise, with readiness to listen to each other, with readiness to dialogue and to build up trust. And frankly speaking, as of now, we don't trust China in this, You can say cooperation, yes, but what is the end of this? As long as we are not able, to discuss and dialogue about certain values, certain issues, and also to compromise on certain issues, be it human rights, be it the question of Uyghur and Kazakh region, and so on, but also on trade and on kind of similar, approaches, it would not work. And I think we have to make clear, and this is our problem, with the double standards, that we defend the liberal world and the liberal sphere of activities. At the same time, our economy, some of our leaders are ready to do everything to please the autocrats, you know? And this is undermining credibility when it comes to peace building, to development cooperation. We cannot tell people in an African state, and African states are very important in the future also, that we are liberal democrats when we work with the autocrats. And I give you a good example later on. It was Paul Biya in Cameroon. You know, on the one hand, we wanted to mediate in the Anglophone crisis. At the same time, we accept that this regime, you know, 40 years in power, uses Geneva as an area to come, to spend holidays, to spend private time, to bring money from Cameroon, etc., etc. This does not work. And here, if we are not very clear and strict, we will lose. But I think there is a chance to turn this around.
Good. Okay, we are also running out of time, so I'll hand over to you, Basu.
Gunther, this is precisely the challenge that we are now facing. And we are discussing it very seriously on the continent because we embraced post-1990 the liberal peace-building model. And unfortunately, 3 decades later, the dividends have not materialized across the continent. So now, when we start to look at how the world is reshaping, let me come to, because China is reshaping the world. And so, Henry, you know, the dominant discourse around peace building, as I've said now, for the last 3 decades has been liberal peace building. China has recently become a more active player. And while it seems that China is open to some of these normative liberal peace values, it contests the content, the approach, and the prioritization. And this is really the crux of all of our challenges now. China has introduced a new element into peace building, namely the democratization of the international system. We want some equality amongst nations. We see it now in the. In addition, China has articulated the sequencing of existing peace-building elements, prioritizing economic development over democratic institution building. Now, let me expand a little bit on the fundamental difference with the 3 decades of dominant liberal peace building that has shaped the discourse. So firstly, the call for democratizing the international system, which China has put out, bears both material and normative implications. It means broadening the representation of participation of developing countries, including China itself, in extant international institutions. Concurrently, it also emphasizes cultural diversity rather than the universality of liberal democracy. Therefore, the democratization of the international system would consequently dilute the power and influence of the US and the West, which serves China's grand strategy of peaceful rise. Secondly, China has pursued an alternative sequencing of existing peace-building elements, as I've said, prioritizing economic development, political stability, and immediate societal needs over democratic institution building. Now, justifications for this alternative sequencing are primarily functional. That's China's approach. This is functional. That's what you were saying, practical. The Chinese discourse contends that the rights to subsistence and development prevail over civil and political rights. This is where we are going now in the future. It's diametrically opposed to what we've seen in the liberal peace-building model. And what Mariam said earlier on in the previous session is that, well, China does not have any pretense. It says this is what we are doing. And therefore, it doesn't have double standards. But on the other side, you profess this and then you say, do something else.
Yeah, no, thank you, Vasu. You summarized well. And what I think actually, I would have a little slightly different view is that I think, you know, we cannot really see the world in a binary view. I mean, autocracy versus democracy and things like that. I think China does have a little uniqueness because it's continentally always an agriculture-based country in tradition. It's highly centralized, anti-floods and irrigation requirement. So it's been the culture of China is really that really it works on that land, and then there's no really expansionist mode there actually. So. What I think is it's interesting is that China always feels that it's important to have some different society. For example, the meritocracy is practiced in China for 2,000 years now. Every year there's 12 million Chinese college graduates voting through examination papers into the system. There's 2 million, college graduates voting through the examination in papers into the government. There is a selection-election process. And then you talk about international democratization. Yes, China is watched by hundreds of countries around the world, media and the NGO and the social human rights group, everybody. The largest opposition party of China is the United States, plus many others. So China is watched everywhere. So they have to adapt, improve, progress. So I think I still remember what Deng Xiaoping has said. Well, if it doesn't matter if black cats or white cats as long as it catches mice, right? So if this system can lift 800 million people out of poverty, if they can become the second largest economy in a few decades, if they can contribute over 1/3 of a global GDP growth, we probably have to tolerate a different model of establishment. And that's why we cannot have due to the culture, geographic, all those differences, we cannot say there's only universal one model. And I think that's the other thing is that we have to really improve, enhance. But I think China needs to work with everybody. Absolutely, China has problems. It's not perfect, definitely. But China has made a lot of progress. I mean, that's obvious that we can see. So I really see that what Chancellor Olaf Scholz is visiting China, and then we have a President Xi visiting France with Macron, and then we have a summit of President Biden and President Xi. Those are really good. We need more people visiting. And also, China recently has opened a free visa unilaterally with a dozen European countries. Welcome everybody, including Swiss, to come to see China. Go to Xinjiang and Tibet and everybody, So progress has been made, and I would really encourage people go to see and find out what's going on. And I found a little bit unfortunate is China doesn't have the narrative sometimes because it doesn't really. The English media is 90% Western media, but so people see outside China and what go back inside China, it's different. Recently, my Center for China Globalization, we hosted the CDU delegation, SPD delegation, Munich Security Conference. Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger was there. And today we're hosting the Kobo Foundation in my office in Beijing. I'm here at the Berlin Moot. I'm glad there's a lot of exchanges. So I think when they see, they will have a little different opinion. That's what we had a reflection. They brought large delegations, and then they felt if they see it, seeing is believing. So I think the most important thing we have to agree, dialogue, communication, better understanding, build up the trust. That's why I highly recommend this model of China, EU, and US food security minister meet to talk about food security of the globally. And let's talk about climate. That's probably even more important. That's the most common threat. We should increase our budget to fight the climate change. Rather than military budget, probably. So I think there's many things we can do. EU is the biggest peace project we've ever seen. I mean, ASEAN is another one. But let's keep it. We hope we have more of those. African Union could be the next if we really works well. So there's many things to be learned. I mean, so this is a great conference. I think that we really have to emphasize peace, including Munich Security Conference, everything. It's really important. And Paris Peace Forum. I'm also a steering committee there, member there. It's really important to talk about peace these days, rather than. And also the other thing I think Olaf Scholz and President Xi agreed in China is that when we have these peace talks, we need to bring all the parties who is in a fight. We cannot exclude the parties in the fight. If we're going to talk a peace dialogue, we need to bring the people in the fighting to talk, with all the guarantors together. So that probably be a great way to do it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, perhaps very briefly, Benta, because I'm also watching now the clock, and we are very pressed for time. Now, in light of the growing violence and wars, there is a feeling that we have to do everything to end, obviously, violence and war. There is a kind of opinion in peacemaking world that we shouldn't now wait for perfectly designed solutions, but we have to work with whatever is there, because the priority is to end violence, and then we can see whether it's possible really to include the society in peacemaking and so on. Yeah. So the tension I'm talking about is obviously the inclusive peacemaking versus getting elite deals and pact. And you have said once that elite deals don't really help. It's about power sharing between the warring parties. It's not about responsibility sharing, which would happen if you include the society. But just looking at the world we're in currently, what do you feel? Do we have to sacrifice on inclusion?
Let me just start by also reiterating the issue that was raised by Al-Ghazim one on the right to protect. I think this is so much, and I'm coming there because of the population that are on the ground that we cannot neglect, and we need to bring them, especially the women. We talk about violence against women in war, the body of the women being used in the battlefields. So then, when we are talking about peacemaking, how do we bring the voice of the voiceless? So we were talking about mediation. And what we see right now is, that when we bring the table and we're analyzing the table, we are putting a lot of resources in those who hold the guns, because we wanted to silence the gun immediately. And I think those actors, the elites that we bring at the table, and we have seen when we did most of the research, is to see that any peace accord that will be just including the elite will not last. That's a reality. So the other issue is, how do we build on the ground an inclusive peace? Where we bring civil society, from the track 3 to track 1. How do we make it more inclusive to include the voice of the women, the voice of the young people? We have seen the youth, the bulk of youth in our continent in Africa. They need a voice because they are the ones that can transform as well. How do we make sure that it is more inclusive? And I think that is that model that we are rethinking. And I think this forum, I have been in many forums. This forum can rethink the model of mediation. What can be done to bring an end, just bringing the voice of the voiceless, those who are on the ground who understand, but also those who get the cuts. I think that model needs to be rethinked. I think Accord and the Berghof Foundation, both of you, we hope that you can bring us on that model to rethink how we can do it to bring peace in not just in Africa, but elsewhere. I just wanted to add one thing on it. I think the issue of indifference and South Africa with Gaza, and when we talk about accountability, we need also to look into how sometime, we not just, looking into Africa alone, but how do we look? Europe looking into Africa, but also Africa looking into Europe and elsewhere, because we need to work on synergy. We need to see how we can together, have together a model where our partners and others can be together to build the peace that we're talking today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. we're almost at the end of the session, unfortunately, Günther. Perhaps you can include that in your final statement. And before I hand over the floor to Vasu to make some final remarks, in 30 seconds, what would be the main message you want to leave with us, also as a takeaway for the audience? What is it in terms of also advice, in terms of recommendation, but a concrete one, either to us as global civil society, the Accord from the Global South and Berghof from the Global North. Also, we have to adapt to the changing landscape, so we can't carry on with what we have been doing. Some people feel that it's still the concepts of the 90s, so we'll have to also adapt. So a piece of advice very shortly in one sentence. Perhaps we start with you, Van.
No, I don't. Yeah, merci. I think maybe if I was just to make, because the point I was trying to, I wanted to make was somehow, well, it's Africa specific, but it concerns also the rest of the world. I wanted to emphasize the importance of governance. And by governance, I really mean something very basic, the ability of the state to meet the basic needs of people, to provide security, and to be seen as fair, as relatively transparent, not necessarily fully corruption-free. That hardly exists. And I believe it's important in the African context because that's really the basis for lasting peace on this continent. And we do have tools. How can we generate greater cooperation between the AU, the UN, and other actors to push harder for the implementation of existing African instruments? I think we can be very creative on that. Thank you.
Günther, please, in one sentence, please.
Long
one has set the bar but high.
Yes, yeah. In a nutshell. I mean, I follow also the idea of the Cameroon. We had a very good approach, I would say a very innovative one. Multi-track from the very beginning with HD, with Swiss Peace, with our ministry, integrated. We were working at all levels, in all directions. And I think we established very good relationship to all actors, including on the ground in the Anglophone region, to the diaspora, to the rebels, to the women's groups, etc. I think this was a very innovative approach because it was integrated from the very beginning. However, after 3 years, we decided to pull the plug, not because of the rebels or the civil society. There was a lot of hope in the Swiss process, not because of Canada. This was a very short period where they completely failed after 6 months. It was because of the government, a corrupt autocracy, old guys, the youth minister is more than 90 years old. And it's unbelievable, but you cannot work with such a government. That's why we pulled the plug. But in a way, of course, I'm sure we will continue and a new process will start, maybe after the end of Paul Biya's government, we will see. But I think the approach as such, with your recommendation also, we worked at all levels, and this worked very well.
Okay.
Yes, I think the conference is absolutely correct. Having some concrete recommendations. I would like to make one. I said before, but I think we need to strengthen the multilateral system, particularly the UN. And I think UN, China is already the second largest donor and also the largest peace-sending country among the P5 member countries. So I think the reform of UN is important. So why can't we get a G20 into that? G20 is the largest economic summit, well represented. African Union, isn't it? So let's get the G20 members rotating into the permanent members, maybe 6 months, maybe 1 year, enjoying the same rights as permanent members. So you have a very good representation, and then you can really get things done. And then we have to, reform this veto system too, so that there is a UN strong resolution. There is a UN force to keep it. And let's really work to strengthen the global government on that.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. It looks like that men have difficulties to keep to one sentence. What about you?
One sentence. It's really about action. I think the recommendation that will be made here, we hope that we will come back to Berlin and we will review the implementation of the recommendation and we see how far they have been implemented. And we need action and not just, talking. Thank you.
Okay, that's the homework for us. Vasu,
No,
with
thank you very much, Lakshmi. I can see Femi breathing down my throat. So we had a few recommendations. I'm going to end with a quote that has a recommendation. And the quote you will all recognize by Gramsci. The old is dying. The new is struggling to be born. This is the time of monsters. Now, whether you are sitting in a room with your advisors with a tie on, it does not make you respectable. You're still a monster if you're doing monstrous things. Or if you're in a room, now you'll catch the subtlety. If you're in a room without your tie on with all your advisors and you're doing monstrous things, it still makes you a monster. Let us not let the monsters win. That's the recommendation. Thank you.